Mr. President, infrastructure is the physical backbone of our country. And it's an example of positive, constructive American achievement and accomplishment. Unfortunately, this particular bill, in its process, content, price tag, and long-term effects, simply will not serve the country, Americans, and particularly Utahns well. It will ultimately be detrimental to our economy, to the daily lives of the American people, and even, in some cases, to infrastructure itself. Now, I'm not saying that I don't appreciate the hard work, goodwill, and excellent intentions of my colleagues who have put many long hours, weeks, and months into crafting it. Nor am I suggesting that there aren't good things in the bill, good things that would benefit deserving people in this country. As I've said before, the question is not whether or not infrastructure is a good and a necessary thing, nor is the question whether the bill contains some good things. The question is rather, how much should the federal government be involved in infrastructure? And if it should, where it should, how much should it be spending on it? The truth is, the particulars of this bill take the scope far beyond what should be under the realm of the federal government, under the domain of the federal government specifically, at a price far beyond what we can afford, at a time when we're already far into feeling the sting of inflation. Now, there is a reason that our founding fathers reserved numerous and indefinite powers for the states, while providing few and defined powers to the federal government. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution literally lists the particular powers given to Congress. It tells us what they are. And you'll notice that infrastructure generally is not one of them. Now, in some cases, it does make sense that the federal government is involved in some infrastructure. The interstate highway system is a good example of that. Postal roads, also specifically accounted for in Article 1, Section 8, are another example of that. This bill, however, includes things like bike paths and beautification projects, mass transit systems, surface roads, roads that start and stop in one state and are not part of the interstate highway system, things that, while good and lovely and useful, are a far cry from what the federal government can and should reasonably and can successfully oversee. What's more, it does so at an enormous price tag, one that will dig us even deeper and deeper into debt at the expense of the American people, both now and further down the road. Now, proponents of the bill insist, and will continue to insist as we debate this, that the bill is paid for. But in fact, despite the staggeringly large amount of money that it spends, estimated to be $1.2 trillion in total, the largest amount for a package of this kind in history, by far, it still does not have a score from the Congressional Budget Office. Normally, we don't vote on, much less pass something like this without a CBO score. We don't have one. And I regret to say that many of the so-called pay-fors amount to flimsy budget gimmicks that, in reality, do no such thing as pay for the bill. So what are these so-called pay-fors? Well, let's take the new reporting requirements on cryptocurrency, for example, which would allegedly bring in $28 billion. Everything about this pay-for is half-baked and unclear. How exactly will additional revenue reporting generate new tax revenue? And how can you possibly apply stock exchange-style reporting requirements to something so different and so decentralized as Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and other blockchain-based cryptocurrencies? At best, this revenue gimmick will fail. At worst, it will hamper financial innovation for decades to come. Or the mandated sales of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which the bill sponsors claim will produce $6 billion in revenue starting 7 years from now. But do we realistically know what the demand for oil might be at that time? Or what could happen in the meantime when we might need to use oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve? Or what happens when we get 5 years down the road and Congress determines that we should hold on to the oil a bit longer until we might be able to generate more revenue from the sale? Or what if even more of these sales are congressionally mandated in these years, essentially flooding the market and causing the price of that same oil to crash? Or take the pension smoothing component of the bill, which would only cause us to lose more money in the long term and simultaneously threaten the solvency of retirement benefits, the retirement benefits of millions and millions of American workers. Or the rebate rule delay, which so far has never and may never go into effect. Delaying something that has no set time for implementation cannot realistically be predicted to produce $49 billion in savings, or the $20 billion in future spectrum auctions. While spectrum auctions can certainly produce a great deal of revenue, this possible future auction may end up never happening. It could have significant restrictions on it due to the dynamics of adjacent bands, or it could simply produce far less than we are being asked to assume today. Finally, take the claim of $205 billion in unused COVID funds. Upon further investigation, it includes only roughly $50.2 billion of unused COVID funds as a real pay-for. The other $150 billion is simply spending that didn't happen because the country began to emerge from the pandemic. Many states ended the enhanced unemployment benefits that were keeping more people out of work, and other states, local communities, businesses, and families didn't require as much federal spending thanks to their own successes and their own resiliency. In other words, this other $150 billion is not a pay-for. It's fake. It's simply spending or lost revenue that was never realized. And whether this bill passes or not, this $150 billion will never be realized. No, Mr. President, the numbers for these pay-fors do not add up. The math for this bill is faulty, to say the least. What's more, much of the massive amount that it will be spending will not even be efficient or effective spending on infrastructure. Even if this were the role of the federal government, then we ought to make sure that it spends those funds efficiently and effectively. But unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that along with federal dollars come a whole host of Byzantine laws and regulations that prevent precisely that, including restrictions imposed by everything from NEPA to the Davis-Bacon Act. The Davis-Bacon Act artificially inflates labor prices by requiring that all federally funded construction projects worth more than $2,000 pay workers at least the prevailing wage rate on non-federal projects in the same locality. And it has substantially driven up the cost of federal projects, hindered economic growth, wasted taxpayer dollars, and hurt unskilled laborers each year. In fact, it's estimated that repealing it would save taxpayers $10.7 billion over 10 years. NEPA has imposed similar burdens and costs. Signed into law in 1970, it was intended to account for the environmental consequences of proposed federal actions or projects. But over the last 50 years, it has substantially deviated from its original purpose, morphing into a complex bureaucratic labyrinth, stalling projects through frivolous lawsuits and bureaucratic delays, and dramatically increasing the cost and timeline of their completion. Sometimes, Mr. President, this law stretches projects that should take a couple of years to complete into decades. At the very least, we ought to reform these costly, ineffective regulations and do so drastically so that federal infrastructure can be completed better and faster, which is exactly what I proposed in the amendment I put before this body yesterday. But this bill, in its current form, is ultimately not good for Utahns, and it's not good for the American people. Dragging more federal money into infrastructure, unfortunately, means we'll pay more to build less. We'll be paying more to build less. It means less money going to steel and concrete in the ground and a whole lot more going to lawyers, accountants, lobbyists, compliance specialists, and bureaucratic delays. It means longer and more expensive projects. Now, this varies state by state, but in Utah, it's estimated that adding federal dollars to a project increases the overall cost by 20%, sometimes as much as 40%. Not only will it mean more expensive projects, but more expensive projects too. Another provision in this bill would impose new fees on dozens of chemicals used in countless products and consumer goods in our day-to-day lives. Chemicals found in concrete, wood, plastics, rubber, dyes, detergents, drugs, and pesticides for food, just to name a few. So every time you buy one of those products, or almost any product for that matter, you'll be paying a little bit for this. Only it's not a tax, it's a fee, and it's hidden from your view. So the consumer, the poor and middle class taxpayer, doesn't see a tax increase, they just see that they're paying even more for everything that they buy. And another provision would extend Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's G fees for an entire decade. These fees could add thousands of dollars to the mortgages of home buyers at a time when that first home is already increasingly out of reach for many. Utahns can't afford this. Congress is supposed to be addressing problems like these, not making them worse with sneaky new fees. Mr. President, this comes at a time when Americans are already feeling the sharp sting of snowballing inflation. Now, this graph highlights some of the problem. It highlights what the American people have felt over the last 12 to 18 months. You'll notice a curve sloping sharply upward. Today, inflation is at 5.4%, which means, on average, the goods you buy today are 5.4% more expensive, and the savings you have responsibly accrued are actually worth less. And don't forget, the federal government's reckless spending has exacerbated this trend. Look at how the red has grown. See, what we see here, the red that you see in this chart, these are deficits. Look at how it's grown. The red portion of the graph is deficit spending. And while we surely needed to spend some additional money during the COVID pandemic, did we really need to spend this much more? To the point where we were borrowing a lot more than we were taking in. You know, Mr. President, we borrowed close to $4 trillion last year. And even if you think that we did need to spend this much more, wouldn't we try to get our country back on track and to discontinue this unfunded spending spree that contributes to runaway inflation? Look, from gas to groceries, from homes to health care, every day it's getting harder for hardworking Americans to afford the basic necessities of day-to-day life. Take just a quick look here at everyday items. These are not luxury items that we associate with the elite. These are things that ordinary people purchase every day. Compared to the period of time before the pandemic, not so very long ago, just 16 months ago, eggs are now 13% more expensive. Milk is 11.3% more expensive. Chicken breast, 11.3% more expensive. Bread is 9.4% more expensive. And gas is more than 27.5% more expensive. The fact is, Mr. President, that packages like this one are not without their effects on the people we've taken an oath to represent. At the end of the day, it is the American people whose tax dollars we take to pay for packages like this. At the end of the day, it is the American people who will bear the brunt of the debt we're forcing on them. At the end of the day, it is the American people who will feel the effects in every aspect of their daily lives, in their workplaces, their communities, and their families. And they should get a say in it. They certainly shouldn't have to sign on to something that was made known to the American people at 10 p.m. on Sunday night. Those who drafted this legislation had 4 months to review it, 4 months to get to know it. The American people shouldn't be asked to pass this in 4 days. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.